Hello, young soul. Welcome to the Daily Horror Channel. If you are afraid of real and scary reports, this channel is not for you. I suggest you leave this video, but if you are not afraid of listening to these horrifying reports, I suggest you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. In the confines of a deserted road on a cold and rainy autumn night, the couple Lucas and Mariana were on a trip to a small town called Aurora, where they planned to spend a peaceful weekend away from the urban hustle and bustle. The environment was eerie, with tall, dense trees that seemed to form a natural wall around the road. The darkness of the night was cut only by the car's headlights and the occasional flash of lightning, which briefly illuminated the gloomy landscape. My name is Lucas. I'm 30 years old, and I work as a nature photographer. My wife, Mariana, is a history teacher with a passion for ancient mysteries. Our life has always been marked by adventures, and this trip to Aurora was just one of them. We decided to explore the small town and its surroundings after hearing fascinating stories about local legends and little-known tourist attractions. We were halfway to our destination when we saw a figure on the side of the road. He was an unkempt-looking man, wearing an old coat and a hat that partially hid his face. He appeared to be hitchhiking, waving with a desperate expression. "Lucas, do you think we should stop?" Mariana asked with a worried expression. I hesitated for a moment, but the rain was heavy and the man looked needy. "We will help you. We can't leave him here in this storm." I stopped the car and rolled down the window. "You need help?" I asked. The man nodded, his voice hoarse and barely audible over the sound of the rain. "Yes, please, I'm going to Aurora. Can you give me a ride?" Mariana and I exchanged quick glances and agreed. "Come in," he said, unlocking the door. He got into the back seat, bringing with him a strange, oppressive feeling that I couldn't immediately identify. "What is your name?" I asked, trying to break the ice. "My name is Arthur," he replied, with a smile that seemed forced. "Thank you for helping me. The roads around here can be quite treacherous." Something about the way he spoke sent a shiver down my spine. Mariana seemed to feel the same discomfort, but she didn't say anything. We continued driving in silence while Arthur watched the road with a distant gaze. As we progressed, the feeling of discomfort increased. I started to notice small, disturbing details. The rearview mirror seemed to show shadows that moved strangely, and at certain moments I could have sworn that Arthur had no reflection. Every time I tried to look directly at him, a feeling of dread came over me. "Do you live in Aurora?" Mariana tried to start a conversation again, breaking the oppressive silence. Arthur smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "I lived there a long time ago. I'm coming back to resolve some issues." Something about the way he said it made my anxiety rise. I continued driving, trying to focus on the road, but the dark thoughts wouldn't leave me alone. The rain seemed to get heavier, and lightning briefly illuminated Arthur's face, revealing an expression that I could only describe as sinister. Suddenly, the car started making strange noises. The engine sputtered, and without warning, the car stopped. "Damn, what was that?" I muttered, trying to start the engine again, but to no avail. "Looks like we're in trouble," Arthur said, his voice sounding closer and more menacing than before. "Maybe I can help fix it." Something in me screamed not to let that man touch the car, but we were in the middle of nowhere, with no cell phone reception and a storm intensifying. Mariana looked at me, concern evident in her eyes. "Okay," she said reluctantly. "Let's see what's going on." We got out of the car and went to the hood. Arthur seemed to know what he was doing, but with each passing moment, the feeling that something was terribly wrong only grew. As he worked on the engine, I began to hear whispers. At first I thought it was the wind, but I soon realized it was coming from all directions. "Did you hear that?" I asked Mariana, but she just shook her head, confused. "No, Luke. What did you hear?" Before I could respond, the whispers became louder and clearer. They sounded like voices, speaking in a language I couldn't identify. Panic started to take over me. Arthur stood up, wiping his hands on his coat. "It looks like there is something serious with the engine. We will need professional help. But don't worry, there's a cabin in the forest where we can take shelter until the storm passes." The idea of following that man into the forest didn't please me at all, but staying in the car parked on the road didn't seem like an option either. Mariana and I exchanged a nervous look, but ended up agreeing to follow Arthur. We walked through the forest, the darkness surrounding us like a cloak. The whispers didn't stop, and the shadows seemed to dance around us. We arrived at an old, decrepit cabin that looked like it was about to collapse. "Come in," said Arthur, opening the door. "We will be safe here." The cabin smelled of mold and rotten wood. The inside was dark, lit only by the dim light of a flashlight Arthur carried. I sat down on an old chair, while Mariana approached me, visibly scared. "Lucas, something is very wrong," she whispered. "We shouldn't have come here." Before I could respond, the cabin door closed with a bang. Arthur turned to us, his face now completely transformed. His eyes glowed with an unearthly intensity, and an evil smile spread across his face. "You were fools to follow me," he said, his voice now distorted and full of malice. "I have been waiting for a sacrifice for a long time." Panic took over me. I got up, trying to find a way out, but the windows were locked and the door seemed sealed by an invisible force. The whispers became screams, and shadows began to materialize around us, forming grotesque figures. "Mariana, we need to get out of here," I shouted, but she was paralyzed by fear. Arthur began reciting words in an ancient language, and the shadowy figures advanced. I felt a biting cold pass through my body as I desperately tried to find a way to escape. The flashlight flickered, briefly revealing the distorted faces of the shadows surrounding us. Amidst the chaos, I remembered something I had read in one of Mariana's books about ancient rituals. I took the flashlight and drew a circle on the floor with the light, reciting the words of protection that came to mind. "May the forces of good protect us. May the light drive out the darkness." The shadows hesitated, and Arthur screamed in agony, his form beginning to disintegrate. The cabin shook, and the windows exploded, letting in the rain and wind. I continued reciting the words, feeling the energy around me shift. With one last scream, Arthur disappeared, and the shadows dissipated. The cabin fell silent, and the dread that enveloped us began to disappear. Mariana fell to the floor, sobbing with relief and terror. "It's okay," she said, trying to comfort her. "He finished." We managed to get out of the hut. Now lit by the dim light of dawn, the storm had passed, and the way back to the road was clear. We found our car, still parked, but miraculously working. We drove back to town in silence, still trying to process what had happened. When we arrived in Aurora, we went straight to the police station where we told our story. The police looked at us skeptically, but promised to investigate the cabin. We returned to our home, determined to put this experience behind us. However, a feeling of restlessness still haunted me. I knew that we had faced something far beyond our understanding, and that the evil we encountered on the road might not be completely defeated. As we prepared for bed, I heard one last whisper in the wind. "We will meet again, Lucas." And so, even with the victory over the terror we faced, I knew that the battle against the forces of darkness was far from over. We were ready to face whatever came, knowing that the true horror would never completely disappear. As we tried to recover from the nightmare we faced on the road, the sense of relief was superficial. Aurora, with its quiet streets and friendly inhabitants, seemed like a safe place at first glance. But the scars from that terrifying night with Arthur were deeply burned into our minds. Mariana and I tried to move forward, but the feeling that something was still very wrong accompanied us at every step. Over the next few days, I started to notice small, disturbing details. Objects in our house moved on their own, doors closed for no apparent reason, and shadows seemed to dance at the edges of my vision. The whispers I thought I left in the cabin began to infiltrate my dreams, turning each night into a harrowing nightmare. One afternoon, while Mariana was at the school where she worked, I decided to investigate more about the cabin and the strange event we experienced. I went to the local library and started researching old records and urban legends about the area. I found mention of an ancient cult that practiced dark rituals in the forest around Aurora. The cult worshipped an entity called the Shadow Elder and believed that human sacrifice was necessary to maintain the balance between the worlds of the living and the dead. The more I read, the more my sense of oppression grew. The descriptions of the rituals were horrific, and the connection to what Arthur had attempted to do became clearer and clearer. I found an old journal written by one of the cult members who had repented of his actions. It described how the cult had been disbanded decades ago, but warned that the entity was still lurking, waiting to be unleashed again. I left the library with a sense of urgency. I needed to tell Mariana what I had discovered. When I got home, I found her sitting on the couch, pale and wide-eyed. "Lucas, something happened while you were away," she said, her voice shaking. "I got a call from an unknown number. A voice whispered my name and said that the Shadow Elder was coming for us." My heart raced. I knew we couldn't just sit around waiting for the terror to find us again. We decided to return to the forest and destroy any trace of the cult, hoping to lift the curse once and for all. That night, with a flashlight and the repentant cult member's journal in hand, we ventured back into the forest. The atmosphere was even heavier and more oppressive than before, and the feeling of being watched accompanied us with every step. We followed the journal's instructions until we found the cabin, now in ruins and overgrown with vegetation. We entered the cabin, shining our flashlight as we walked. Shadows danced on the walls and whispers seemed to come from every direction. We found the makeshift altar where Arthur had attempted to perform the ritual. The melted candles and strange symbols were covered in dust and cobwebs. "We have to destroy this," Mariana said with determination. "We have to end the connection between this place and the entity." We began to break down the altar and tear down the symbols on the walls. But as we destroyed the remnants of the cult, the shadows grew more agitated and the whispers more intense. Suddenly, the lantern flickered and went out, plunging us into total darkness. I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder, and a shiver ran down my spine. I turned quickly but saw nothing. Panic began to take hold of me, but I knew we could not stop. "Lucas, recite the words from the journal," Mariana cried, her voice full of desperation. With shaking hands, I opened the journal and began to recite the banishment ritual that the repentant member had written. The ancient words came out of my mouth with difficulty, and the shadows around us began to writhe and retreat. "May the Shadow Elder be banished forever. May his influence over this world end now." A bright light emanated from the journal, illuminating the cabin and causing the shadows to scream in agony. Arthur's form appeared again, but this time his expression was one of pure despair. With a final scream, he and the shadows were consumed by the light, leaving the cabin in absolute silence. Mariana and I fell to the ground, exhausted and relieved. We knew we had achieved an important victory, but the feeling that something was still lurking in the shadows would not leave us. As we hugged each other, trying to find comfort in each other, I heard a final whisper on the wind. "You cannot escape the Shadow Elder. We will meet again." And so, even with the apparent victory over the terror we faced, we knew that the battle against the forces of darkness was far from over. We were ready to face whatever came, knowing that the true horror would never completely disappear. As we recovered from the battle that had just taken place in the cabin, the sense of relief was superficial. Mariana and I, sitting on the ground, hugged each other for comfort, but the darkness around us seemed alive, pulsing with a sinister energy that we could not ignore. "Lucas, we need to get out of here," Mariana said, her voice shaking. I nodded, and we started to get up, still panting and shaken. We grabbed the flashlight that had miraculously started working again and walked out of the cabin toward the trail. The forest seemed more oppressive than ever. The tall, dense trees blocked out most of the moonlight, and the silence was unsettling. We walked quickly, but with each step, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Suddenly, the trail fell apart before us. It was as if the forest had changed, reconfigured to keep us trapped. We felt a biting chill, and the whispers began again, this time louder and clearer. "You can't escape," the voices said, punctuated by ghoulish laughter. Mariana gripped my hand tightly. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. I tried to remain calm. "We have to find a way. Keep walking until we find a way out." But deep down, I felt like something was leading us into a trap. As we walked through the forest, the whispers turned to screams. The shadows around us twisted and moved closer, as if they were trying to touch us. I felt cold hands tugging at my coat, and my flashlight flickered frantically before going out completely. In the darkness, I heard Mariana scream, "Lucas, help!" I ran toward her voice, groping in the dark. I felt her hand, but something was wrong. When the light from the flashlight returned for a moment, I saw that it wasn't Mariana, but a hideous figure with empty eyes and a twisted smile. It was Arthur, or what was left of him. "Did you think you could get rid of me?" said the figure, its voice an echo of agony and hatred. I let go of his hand and stepped back, terror filling my body. "What do you want?" I screamed. "You opened the door. You brought the Shadow Elder back," he replied, slowly approaching. "Now you must pay the price." Mariana appeared at my side, panting. "Lucas, we must run." We grabbed each other's hands and ran through the forest, but the feeling of desperation was overwhelming. The screams and laughter of the shadows surrounded us, and the forest seemed to close in ever closer. Suddenly we came to a clearing illuminated by a spectral light. In the center was a stone altar covered in ancient symbols. The figure of Arthur stood there waiting for us. "You cannot escape your fate," he said with a sinister smile. "The Shadow Elder demands your sacrifice." I felt an invisible force pulling me towards the altar. I struggled against it, but it was useless. Mariana was thrown against a tree, and I screamed her name, but my voice was drowned out by the whispers and screams. "No!" I cried, feeling the force press me against the altar. Arthur raised a ceremonial dagger, ready to complete the ritual. I looked at Mariana, our gazes meeting for a brief, desperate moment. "Lucas!" she screamed, but before I could react, the dagger came down, and excruciating pain washed over me. I felt my life drain away as the shadows around us danced and laughed. The last thing I saw was Arthur's triumphant smile, and the last thing I heard was the Shadow Elder's whisper, "You are ours forever." Mariana, wounded and desperate, tried to crawl to me, but she knew it was too late. The ritual was complete, and the Shadow Elder had won. As darkness enveloped me, I knew my sacrifice would not be the last. The battle against the forces of darkness was far from over, and the true terror would never completely fade. Mariana was left alone in the clearing, the shadows slowly receding, but the terror still palpable. She knew the entity was free, and the true nightmare was only just beginning. In the small town of Pedra Negra, nestled in the mountains and shrouded in mystery, there was a delivery man named Miguel. Young and full of ambition, he sought a way to earn a living while dreaming of something bigger. At 28 years old, Miguel had a past marked by family tragedies that made him resilient, but also curious about the inexplicable. Pedra Negra, with its narrow streets and old houses, was the perfect setting for someone with such an inquisitive mind. One afternoon, after a routine of ordinary deliveries, Miguel received an unusual delivery order. The address was not on the map, and the locals seemed unaware of its existence. The order was a small package, wrapped in old, yellowed brown paper. The sender was only a name, a Casa de Helio, with no other information. Intrigued, Miguel decided to investigate. When driving to the indicated location, he noticed that the road was little used, almost overgrown. The atmosphere grew more oppressive as he moved forward, the thick fog making it difficult to see. Finally, he spotted an old, abandoned house, surrounded by twisted trees that seemed to be watching over the surroundings. The feeling of cold and oppression was palpable, as if something was waiting there. This must be some kind of joke, he muttered to himself, trying to push away his growing fear. He got out of the car, holding the package tightly. He approached the worn door and knocked, but the sound echoed in an unsettling silence. He decided to leave the package on the porch and leave quickly. But as he turned to leave, he heard a faint noise, almost a whisper, coming from inside the house. He turned slowly, curiosity overcoming his fear. He pushed the door open, which creaked open, revealing a dark, dusty interior. The air was cold and heavy. As he walked forward, shadows danced on the walls, and whispers seemed to come from every corner. The house seemed alive, breathing to the rhythm of his steps. "Is anyone there?" he asked, his voice echoing in the void. No answer, just the oppressive silence. He continued exploring, finding old photos of people who looked familiar. In one of them, he recognized a familiar face. It was Dr. Halio, a famous doctor from the village who had mysteriously disappeared years ago. The story said that he performed dark experiments on patients seeking immortality. Miguel began to feel a growing presence around him, as if he were being watched. Objects moved on their own, and he could hear whispers calling his name. A chill ran down his spine when he realized that the shadows seemed to be following him. He tried to calm himself, but the terror was overwhelming. He found a staircase that led down to a basement. The door was ajar, revealing an even denser darkness. He descended slowly, each step creaking under his weight. The air grew colder and heavier with each step. When he reached the basement, he saw a table with unlit candles and old surgical instruments. In the center, a macabre-looking diary. He leafed through the diary, discovering that Dr. Halio had performed dark rituals to prolong life, but something had gone terribly wrong. The patients had died, and their souls had become trapped in the house, haunting anyone who came near. Miguel realized that Dr. Halio's spirit was still there, searching for a new body to inhabit. Suddenly, the temperature in the basement plummeted, and the candles lit themselves. Miguel felt a cold hand touch his shoulder and saw the spectral figure of Dr. Halio materialize before him. The spirit was pale and disfigured, with empty eyes that seemed to pierce his soul. "You have come to bring me salvation," the spirit whispered, its voice echoing like a lament. Miguel tried to run, but an invisible force held him back. The spirit advanced, and the feeling of cold and oppression grew. Desperate, Miguel began to recite the words he had found in the diary, hoping to drive away the evil presence. The spirit hesitated, but the force holding him did not diminish. "You can't escape," the spirit shouted, its voice reverberating off the walls. With a supreme effort, Miguel managed to free himself and ran for the exit. The shadows around him writhed, trying to stop him. When he finally reached the door, he felt an invisible hand grab his ankle, pulling him back. He struggled with all his might, but the darkness seemed to swallow him. Suddenly, everything went silent. Miguel opened his eyes and saw that he was outside the house, the fog beginning to dissipate. He looked back and saw the house shrouded in thick mist, as if it had never existed. He felt a momentary relief, but he knew that the nightmare was not over. He got back in the car and left quickly, his heart still racing. In the following days, Miguel tried to forget what happened, but the disturbing events continued. He felt watched, heard whispers in the stillness of the night, and saw shadows moving in the periphery of his vision. He knew that Dr. Halio's spirit was still with him, looking for an opportunity to take over his body. Determined to end the curse, Miguel returned to the house with a plan. He took a village priest with him, believing that the blessing could free the trapped souls. When they arrived, the house seemed even more sinister. They entered together, reciting prayers as they went. In the basement, Dr. Halio's spirit appeared again, angrier than ever. The priest continued praying, and the spectral figure began to disintegrate, screaming in agony. The shadows dissipated, and a strange peace took over the environment. Miguel and the priest left the house feeling relieved. The village of Pedra Negra was finally free of the curse. However, Miguel knew that his life would never be the same. The terror he experienced left deep scars, and he would always remember the day he faced the spirit of Dr. Helio. As they left the place, Miguel looked back one last time. In the back of his mind, he knew that even though the spirit had been banished, the darkness still lurked, waiting for a new opportunity to manifest itself. The story of the mysterious package seemed to have come to an end, but Miguel felt that this was just the beginning of an ongoing fight against the dark forces that inhabited the world. In the small town of Pedra Negra, nestled in the mountains and shrouded in a veil of mystery, there was a delivery man named Miguel. Young and full of ambitions, he looked to his profession as a way to make a living while dreaming of something bigger. At 28 years old, Miguel had a past marked by family tragedies that made him resilient, but also curious about the inexplicable. Pedra Negra, with its narrow streets and old houses, was the perfect setting for someone with such an inquisitive mind. One afternoon, after a routine of common deliveries, Miguel received an unusual delivery order. The address was not on the map, and residents seemed unaware of its existence. The order was a small package wrapped in old, yellowed brown paper. The sender was just a name, a Casa de Helio, with no other information. Intrigued, Miguel decided to investigate. When driving to the indicated location, he noticed that the road was little used, almost overgrown with bush. The atmosphere became more oppressive as it progressed, with the dense fog making vision difficult. Finally, he saw an old, abandoned house, surrounded by twisted trees that seemed to watch over the environment. The feeling of cold and oppression was palpable, as if something was waiting there. "This must be some kind of joke," he muttered to himself, trying to shake off his growing fear. He got out of the car, holding the package tightly. He approached the worn door and knocked, but the sound echoed in an unsettling silence. He decided to leave the package on the porch and quickly leave. But as he turned to leave, he heard a faint noise, almost a whisper, coming from inside the house. He turned slowly, curiosity overcoming fear. He pushed the door open, and it creaked open, revealing a dark, dusty interior. The air was cold and heavy. As he advanced, shadows danced on the walls and whispers seemed to come from every corner. The house seemed alive, breathing to the rhythm of his steps. "Is there anyone there?" he asked, his voice echoing in the void. No answer, just oppressive silence. He continued exploring, finding old photos of people who looked familiar. In one of them, he recognized a familiar face. It was Dr. Helio, a famous doctor in the village who had mysteriously disappeared years ago. Stories said he performed dark experiments on patients seeking immortality. Miguel began to feel a growing presence around him, as if he was being watched. Objects moved on their own, and he could hear whispers calling his name. He felt a chill run down his spine when he realized that the shadows seemed to follow him. He tried to calm down, but the terror was overwhelming. He found a staircase leading down to a basement. The door was ajar, revealing an even denser darkness. He descended slowly, each step creaking under his weight. The air grew colder and heavier with each step. Upon reaching the basement, he saw a table with unlit candles and old surgical instruments. In the center, a macabre-looking diary. He leafed through the diary, discovering that Dr. Helio had performed dark rituals to prolong his life. But something went terribly wrong. The patients died, and their souls were trapped in the house, haunting anyone who came close. Miguel realized that Dr. Helio's spirit was still there, looking for a new body to inhabit. Suddenly, the temperature in the basement plummeted and the candles lit themselves. Miguel felt an icy hand touch his shoulder and saw the spectral figure of Dr. Helio materialize before him. The spirit was pale and disfigured, with empty eyes that seemed to pierce his soul. "You came to bring my salvation," whispered the spirit, his voice echoing like a lament. Miguel tried to run, but an invisible force held him back. The spirit advanced, and the feeling of cold and oppression increased. Desperate, Miguel began reciting the words he found in the diary, hoping to ward off the evil presence. The spirit hesitated, but the strength holding it did not diminish. "You can't escape," the spirit shouted, his voice reverberating off the walls. With a supreme effort, Miguel managed to free himself and ran to the exit. The shadows around him twisted, trying to stop him. When he finally reached the door, he felt an invisible hand grab his ankle, pulling him back. He fought with all his might, but the darkness seemed to swallow him. Suddenly, everything went silent. Miguel opened his eyes and saw that he was outside the house. The fog was beginning to dissipate. He looked back and saw the house shrouded in thick fog, as if it had never existed. He felt momentary relief, but he knew the nightmare wasn't over. He got back into the car and drove off quickly, his heart still racing. In the following days, Miguel tried to forget what happened, but the disturbing events continued. He felt watched, heard whispers in the stillness of the night, and saw shadows moving in the periphery of his vision. He knew that Dr. Helio's spirit was still with him, looking for an opportunity to take over his body. Determined to end the curse, Miguel returned to the house with a plan. He took a village priest with him, believing that the blessing could free the trapped souls. When they arrived, the house seemed even more sinister. They entered together, reciting prayers as they went. In the basement, Dr. Helio's spirit appeared again, angrier than ever. The priest continued praying, and the spectral figure began to disintegrate, screaming in agony. The shadows dissipated, and a strange peace took over the environment. Miguel and the priest left the house feeling relieved. The village of Pedra Negra was finally free of the curse. However, Miguel knew that his life would never be the same. The terror he experienced left deep scars, and he would always remember the day he faced the spirit of Dr. Helio. As they left the place, Miguel looked back one last time. In the back of his mind, he knew that even though the spirit had been banished, the darkness still lurked, waiting for a new opportunity to manifest itself. The story of the mysterious package seemed to have come to an end, but Miguel felt that this was just the beginning of an ongoing fight against the dark forces that inhabited the world. During the following nights, Miguel was unable to rest. Nightmares tormented him, bringing back visions of Dr. Helio and the dark rituals. With every shadow that moved in the darkness of his room, he felt his panic rising. One night, he woke up in a cold sweat, feeling a presence at his side. When he turned on the light, he saw handprints on his arm, as if something had grabbed him while he slept. The next day, he met Beatriz, an old friend who knew a lot about the stories and legends of Pedra Negra. He told her everything that had happened, hoping to find an explanation or help. "Miguel, these things don't disappear so easily. Dr. Helio's spirit may have been banished, but his influence is still here. We need to do something more," said Beatriz, worried. Together, they decided to carry out a more in-depth search into the history of Dr. Helio and his rituals. They discovered that he was not only trying to prolong his life, but also looking for a way to transfer his soul to another body, thus escaping final death. This explained why he was so desperate to possess Miguel. Beatriz suggested that they needed a complete exorcism and protective ritual to ensure the spirit did not return. They convinced the priest to perform the ritual again, but this time with more preparation and understanding of what they were facing. They returned to the house, this time equipped with everything they needed. As they recited prayers and spread holy water, the house began to shake. The shadows came to life again, and the spirit of Dr. Helio appeared, more furious than ever. "Do you think you can get rid of me? I am eternal," shouted the spirit, his voice echoing in their minds. Miguel felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if something was trying to tear his body from the inside out. The priest intensified the prayers, and Beatriz threw more holy water around. The spirit figure began to slowly disintegrate, but the fight was far from over. Suddenly, an intense light filled the basement, and the spirit let out a deafening scream. Miguel felt the pain disappear and realized that the shadows were dissipating. Dr. Halio's figure finally crumbled into dust and the house fell silent. When they left, Miguel felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. He knew that this time they had succeeded. The curse seemed to have been broken, and Blackstone could finally breathe a sigh of relief. However, upon returning home, Miguel found one last item that gave him goosebumps. The mysterious package he had delivered was once again on his porch. This time, the sender was himself. He opened the package with shaking hands, finding only a small antique mirror and a note. "Not everything that is banned remains lost. I'll be watching you." Miguel knew that despite the victory, the fight against the dark forces was far from over. And so, the story of the mysterious package continues, awaiting the next chapter in the shadows of the night, where the true terror still lurks, waiting for the opportunity to reveal itself again. Upon finding the mysterious package again on his porch, Miguel felt an icy shiver run down his spine. The antique mirror reflected his face, but the image seemed distorted, as if another presence was looking back. The note inside the package contained only one cryptic sentence. "Not everything that is banned remains lost. I'll be watching you." The following days were constant torture. Miguel felt watched every moment, and the nightmares that once tormented him became more vivid and terrible. He saw Dr. Halio's face in every shadow, hearing whispers of promises of eternal torment. The feeling of cold and oppression returned with overwhelming force, making it difficult to even breathe. Desperate, he decided to seek help again. Beatrice and the priest returned to the house, where they met with Miguel to discuss the next step. They knew that Dr. Halio's spirit had been banished, but something was still very wrong. There was a greater evil that needed to be faced, something they couldn't just ignore. On the night of the final ritual, they returned to the abandoned house, armed with all the protections and blessings they could muster. Upon entering the house, the atmosphere was thicker and more oppressive than ever. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the whispers were almost deafening. In the basement, they found the old mirror again, shining with an evil light. Miguel's reflection showed not only him, but also the figure of Dr. Halio, smiling with deep hatred. Beatrice took the mirror, and the priest began to recite the prayers with renewed intensity. Suddenly, the mirror exploded into a blinding light, and the spirit of Dr. Halio appeared once again, furious and desperate. The priest continued his prayers, and Beatrice spread holy water around, but the spirit seemed stronger than ever. The house shook, and the shadows became almost palpable, trying to grab Miguel. "You can never get rid of me," shouted Dr. Halio, advancing on Miguel with indescribable fury. With one last effort, Miguel picked up the broken mirror and pointed it at the spirit. The reflected light began to burn the spectral figure, who screamed in agony. The shadows retreated, and the invisible force holding Miguel began to weaken. But before the spirit disappeared completely, he cast a final curse. "Even if I disappear, my mark will be with you forever. You will never be truly free." With one last scream, Dr. Halio's spirit disintegrated, and the house fell silent. Miguel fell to his knees, exhausted and shaken. Beatrice and the priest helped him out of the house, feeling momentary relief. But Dr. Halio's final warning echoed in their minds. In the months that followed, Miguel tried to get his life back on track. The supernatural events stopped, but he always felt a presence watching him from the shadows. The broken mirror was buried in a remote place, but the mark of Dr. Halio's spirit continued to haunt him. The village of Pedra Negra seemed to finally be at peace, but Miguel knew that, somewhere deep in the shadows, evil still awaited. And so, the story of the mysterious package ended with apparent tranquility, but true terror lurked, waiting for the opportunity to reveal itself again. Miguel was free, but at the same time, trapped in a destiny that he could never completely escape. Darkness still had its claws in his heart, ready to manifest itself in the most unexpected night. In the small town of Val das Flores, where everyone knew everyone and secrets were rare, an old and charming building hid a disturbing mystery. Between the mountains that surrounded the city and the tranquility of the streets, a young couple moved into an apartment on the top floor. Anna and Lucas were eager to start a new life together, without knowing that the silence that enveloped the building and its residents held a dark secret. In the apartment directly below theirs, there lived a reclusive and silent man, Mr. Fernando, who was rarely seen or heard. My name is Anna. After years of struggling in a big city, Lucas and I decided it was time to find a calmer place to build our lives. Val das Flores seemed perfect, a small town surrounded by nature with a welcoming community. We found a charming apartment in an old building, and we couldn't wait to start this new phase. The first few days were full of hope and happiness. The apartment was spacious with large windows that let in sunlight, and a small garden where I could plant my favorite flowers. The neighborhood was quiet, and the residents, although reserved, seemed friendly. However, I soon noticed something peculiar. Our downstairs neighbor, Mr. Fernando, was never seen. The windows in his apartment were always closed, and there was no sound coming from there. One night, while Lucas was away on a work trip, I started hearing strange noises. It was a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like whispers and light footsteps. I thought it was my imagination. But the noises continued the following nights, always coming from downstairs. I decided to ignore it, attributing it to the noises from the old building. Over time, the strange events intensified. Objects in our apartment started disappearing and reappearing in different places. One morning, I found a chair in our dining room overturned, as if someone had moved it. Lucas was starting to think I was becoming paranoid, but the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me. I decided to investigate more about Mr. Fernando. I asked the neighbors, but everyone seemed to avoid talking about him. An elderly woman, Dona Helena, reluctantly told me that he had lost his wife many years ago, and that since then he had not been the same. He never got over her death, she said with a worried look. But it's better not to get involved, darling. He prefers to be alone. Curiosity and restlessness wouldn't leave me alone. One night, while Lucas was sleeping, I silently went down the stairs and approached Mr. Fernando's door. I put my ear to it and heard something that gave me goosebumps, indistinct whispers and a scratching sound. Before I could do anything, the door opened slightly, and a shadow quickly passed me, disappearing into the dark hallway. I ran back to our apartment, my heart racing, not knowing what to think. The days turned into weeks, and the tension continued to build. One night, during a storm, I woke up to a loud sound, as if something had fallen downstairs. I grabbed a flashlight and, with my heart racing, went down again. The door to Mr. Fernando's apartment was ajar, and a dim light was coming from inside. Very scared, I pushed the door and entered. The apartment was in chaos. Broken furniture, scattered papers, and a pungent smell of mold and despair. In the center of the room, I found an old violin with broken strings and covered in dust. That's when I noticed a figure in the corner of the room watching me with empty, sad eyes. It was Mr. Fernando, but he looked more like a shadow than a man. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice full of sadness and anger. Before I could respond, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I quickly turned around, but there was no one. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. I ran out of the apartment, locking the door behind me. When I got back to our apartment, Lucas was awake, looking at me worriedly. I told him what had happened, but he seemed skeptical. "Anna, you need to rest. You're stressing too much about this story." Even with Lucas's reluctance to believe, I continued my investigation. I went back to the local library and looked for any records about Mr. Fernando and his wife. I discovered that she had died tragically, falling from the window of their apartment. Some said it was an accident. Others whispered it was something more sinister. There were rumors that Mr. Fernando never got over the loss and that something had changed in him since then. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard whispers again and the sound of light footsteps. This time, I wasn't alone. Lucas heard it too, and finally believed me. We decided to go down together to confront Mr. Fernando. When we arrived at his apartment, the door was locked, but the sounds were clearly coming from inside. We knocked on the door, calling for him, but there was no answer. Suddenly the sounds stopped. The silence was oppressive, and the sense of imminent danger was palpable. We returned to our apartment, but something had changed. The atmosphere was charged, and the temperature seemed to have dropped drastically. Lucas tried to calm me down, but I could see the fear in his eyes. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Shadows moved across the walls, objects disappeared and reappeared in impossible places, and the whispers became louder and more insistent. We felt like something was watching us, waiting for the right moment to attack. One night, while Lucas was away on another work trip, I heard a sound that seemed to be coming from the attic. I took the flashlight and climbed the narrow, creaky stairs. The attic was dark and cold, smelling musty and abandoned. In the corner, I found an old box full of photos and letters. Among them was a farewell letter from Mr. Fernando's wife, full of sadness and despair. She mentioned the violin and how it had become an obsession for Fernando, a connection to something dark and evil. Suddenly, I felt a presence next to me. I turned and saw a female figure, pale and ethereal, with eyes full of pain. She stared at me and then disappeared. Fear gripped me, but I also felt an urgency to discover the truth. I went down from the attic and returned to Mr. Fernando's apartment. The door was ajar, and I entered cautiously. I found Fernando lying on the floor holding the broken violin. His eyes were open, but lifeless. All around him, shadows moved, whispering words I couldn't understand. It was then that I realized he had become a prisoner of his own obsession, connected to his wife's spirit in a way that couldn't be undone. The violin seemed to pulse with an energy of its own. I picked it up with shaking hands and, without thinking, threw it to the ground, breaking it even more. The shadows around Fernando began to dissipate, and he let out one last breath. The feeling of oppression lessened, and peace began to return to the apartment. I went back up to our apartment. Exhausted and shaken but relieved, I told Lucas what had happened, and he hugged me, promising that we would be safe now. But a part of me knew that the darkness never completely disappears. There is always something lurking, waiting for the right moment to return. And so, my story continues, marked by fear and constant vigilance. True tranquility is still out of reach, and the battle for our mental peace is constant. I hope that one day, finally, we can find true peace, away from the shadows that still surround us. The darkness may recede, but it never completely disappears, always ready to strike again. In the following days, the feeling of relief was brief. Lucas and I tried to get back to our routine, but something dark was hanging over us. The nights were restless, and the whispers returned, more insistent and disturbing. We felt that the presence of Fernando and his wife were still with us, and the feeling of being watched never completely disappeared. One night, while Lucas was out again, I heard a sound that seemed to come from the garden. I approached the window and saw a shadow moving between the trees. I grabbed a flashlight and headed out, determined to find out what was going on. The cold night wind cut into my skin, and each step felt heavier than the last. In the middle of the garden, I found something that made me freeze. A small, broken porcelain doll with empty eyes that seemed to be watching me. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and when I turned around, I saw the figure of a woman, the same one I had seen in the attic. She was closer now, her sad eyes fixed on mine. "Help me," she whispered, and the pain in her voice was palpable. Before she could respond, she disappeared, leaving me alone in the garden. I went back inside, my heart beating fast. I knew I needed to find out more about what was going on. I went back to the attic and started looking for more clues. Among the old letters and photos, I found Fernando's diary. Pages of it were filled with disturbing notes about rituals and attempts to communicate with his wife's spirit. He believed that through the violin he could bring her back. But there was something else. a dark entity he had accidentally summoned. As I read the diary, I heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. I turned quickly and saw Fernando's figure, pale and ghostly, approaching me. "You cannot undo what has been done," he said, his voice echoing in the attic. "She is trapped here because of me, and now you are too." I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder, and the feeling of oppression returned with full force. I fought against my fear and continued reading the diary, searching for anything that might help. I found one last entry mentioning a banishing ritual, but it was risky and could have unpredictable consequences. Desperate, I decided to give it a try. I prepared the necessary items and began to recite the words of the ritual. The atmosphere grew even heavier, and the shadows around me began to move, forming grotesque and distorted figures. Fernando tried to stop me, but I kept my focus, determined to lift the curse once and for all. Suddenly, I heard a high-pitched scream and saw the figure of Fernando's wife, her eyes filled with despair and pain. "Please help me," she begged, and I felt a surge of compassion mixed with fear. I continued the ritual, my voice shaking but steady. The shadows began to recede and Fernando's figure slowly faded, leaving only a distant echo. His wife smiled at me, a look of relief on her face. "Thank you," she whispered before disappearing in a beam of light. I felt an immediate peace, but I also knew that the danger had not been completely eliminated. I climbed down from the attic, exhausted and shaken, but determined to protect my family. I told Lucas what had happened, and he hugged me, promising that we would be safe. However, the whispers and shadows never completely disappeared. The dark presence was still there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to return. And so my story continues, marked by fear and constant vigilance. True peace is still just out of reach, and the battle for our sanity is never ending. As I write these words, I know that the darkness never completely disappears. There is always something lurking, waiting for the right moment to return. And so I remain vigilant, knowing that true peace is a constant battle. The darkness may retreat, but it never completely disappears, always ready to strike again. And now, every time I hear a whisper or see a shadow move at the edge of my vision, I am reminded of what we face and what is yet to come. The fight against the darkness is never ending, and vigilance is our only defense. True tranquility is still just out of reach, but we continue to fight, hoping that one day we will find peace away from the shadows that still surround us. Despite my efforts to maintain peace, the restlessness continued to grow. Nights were filled with disturbing dreams, and the feeling of being watched never went away. Lucas tried to comfort me, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He too sensed the dark presence that haunted us, even if he didn't want to admit it. One night, while Lucas was away on a business trip, I decided to face whatever was haunting us once and for all. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed up to the attic, determined to find a way to lift the curse on Fernando and his wife. The air in the attic was thick and cold, and each step seemed harder than the last. In the middle of the attic, I saw the figures of Fernando and his wife, now clearer and more defined than ever. "Why don't you leave us alone?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What more do you want?" Fernando looked at me with empty eyes, and his wife whispered, "We want freedom, but there's something you don't understand yet." Before I could ask what it was, the shadows around them began to move frantically, forming an even darker and more oppressive figure. It was the entity Fernando had summoned, a force of pure evil that now surrounded us. I felt absolute dread wash over me as the entity approached, its eyes glowing with inhuman hatred. I began to recite the banishing ritual I had found in the journal, my voice weak but determined. The shadows reacted violently, and the entity let out a scream of fury that shook the attic. The figures of Fernando and his wife began to fade, their expressions of pain and despair deepening. "You cannot save us," Fernando said, his voice echoing like a distant whisper. "We are but the bearers of the curse. True evil is beyond our control." The entity advanced on me, and I felt a crushing pressure in my chest. I struggled to continue the ritual, but my strength was fading. Suddenly, the flashlight fell from my hand and went out, plunging the attic into total darkness. The presence of the entity was overwhelming, and I felt my vision begin to darken. At the last moment, I heard Lucas's voice calling my name from downstairs. His voice gave me one last flash of strength, and I screamed the final words of the ritual with all the energy I had left. The entity let out a final scream, and the pressure in my chest disappeared. When the lights came back on, the attic was empty. Fernando and his wife had disappeared, but the feeling of danger persisted. I walked down the stairs shakily and found Lucas, who had arrived home early. He hugged me, but I noticed something strange in his eyes. There was a darkness there, a shadow that shouldn't be there. In the days that followed, Lucas began to act strangely. He was further away and his eyes always seemed lost. I tried to talk to him about what had happened, but he just smiled unsettlingly and said everything was fine. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering next to me. I turned and saw Lucas sitting on the edge of the bed, mumbling words in a language I didn't recognize. His eyes were completely black and a sinister smile distorted his face. "Lucas?" I called, my voice shaking with fear. He slowly turned to me, and the entity I thought I had banished looked at me through his eyes. "Did you think you could defeat me?" said the entity, using Lucas's voice. "Now, we are united, and you will never be free." Absolute terror came over me. I knew the battle was lost and that the darkness had found a new host. The curse hadn't been destroyed, just transferred to the man I loved. I felt a wave of despair as the entity's presence grew stronger, enveloping us in its icy embrace. That night I realized that the real fight against the darkness was just beginning. As the entity settled in Lucas, I knew we would never be safe again. The curse was alive, and the terror that surrounded us was eternal. And so, my story continues, marked by fear and constant vigilance. The darkness has found a new home, and the true terror is knowing that it will never completely disappear. True peace is out of reach, and the battle for our sanity is never ending. The darkness may recede, but it will always find a way to return, stronger and more terrifying than ever.